Today we're going to look at simple measuring tools such as a ruler, a yard or meter stick, and a tape measure. They're all basically the same, so in my representations today, it would just be a standard ruler. Most rulers nowadays have two sides. They'll have the imperial side and the metric side. I'm just going to treat it one system at a time. And ultimately, what you're going to do in class is you're just going to practice using a ruler or a tape measure. And if you've done it already, it's really easy. And if you haven't done it, it's really easy. So the first one we'll look at is the metric system. And the ruler you see here is scaled in centimeters. And by that, I mean that when you see these numbers right here, any numbers represented, they would represent the unit of measure. So the numbers represent how the ruler is graduated, but you'll also see another unit of measure here, a millimeter. Now we know millimeters are smaller than centimeters, and what these graduations show is each one of these distances right here, each one of these really small distances right here represents a millimeter. Remember what a millimeter is? It's a thickness of a dime. So in using a metric ruler then, it's just a matter of putting the ruler onto the object, start at 0, and the end is whatever the measure actually is. So here's another example of a metric ruler with a few measurements taken. Imagine these were actually recorded. You put your ruler down and you measured out how long something was. And again, when we actually read a metric ruler, it's a two-part problem. The first thing we do is we look at the centimeter portion first. And I'll go through what I mean by that. But when we're using a ruler, we're going to look for the centimeter unit first, and again as a number, and then we're going to look for the millimeter part, which is the in-between, I'll call it. And I'll try to use this language consistently, and you'll see how easy it is. And if we do that, we're going to answer in centimeters, but we could also answer in millimeters as well. So we'll do a couple of examples of each. So if we look at A, imagine we measured something, and that's where it measured to. Well, the first thing I'm going to look at is the numbers, and this is obviously in between 1 and 2. So I know that the measure of A is 1 point something centimeters. So I'm going to put that right now. So A is 1 point something, and now in order to figure out the point something, we just simply count the number of little hash marks from 1 till that measure. And the number of little hash marks is 5. And remember, that every little hash mark represents 1 millimeter. So in this method of measurement, we have simply used the centimeter part first, the number part, and we've got 1.5 centimeters. Well, we could also answer in millimeters as long as we understand this simple relationship. There are 10 millimeters in 1 centimeter. So instead of counting in 1, 2, 3, we could count in 10, 20, 30. So if we looked at A, well, there'd be between 10 and 20 millimeters, and we know they're 10 plus 5, so there would be 15 millimeters. So again, when we read these things, do the numbers first. Numbers count as centimeters, then do the in-between second, that's the point, we should also be able to just count in millimeters, and instead of counting 1, 2, 3 millimeters, 10, 20, 30. So I'll do one more, and then I'll have you do the rest. So if we look at B, B is in between. B is in between 2 and 3. So I know that this is at least 2 point something centimeters. And in order to figure out the point something, I count the graduations, and the graduation is going to go from there to there, and there are 9. So in centimeters, this is going to be 2.9 centimeters. Remember, in millimeters, though, millimeters, instead of 1, it counts as a 10. So we have our answers between 20 and 30, and it's a lot closer to 30. And again, when we use the 20 and the 9, 29 millimeters. So what I'd like you to do is pause the video and go through, and for C to G, figure out how many centimeters there are and figure out how many millimeters there are. So you've paused the video, and I'm going to write the answers I got. I'll do in centimeters first. And millimeters second. And again, I'm not doing any conversions here, I'm just counting. So hopefully you've had this experience. And it's not new. So let's flip on to the imperial system. Now the imperial system, you might not have had a lot of experience with. If you've been in a woodworking class, you probably have. But if you haven't, you probably haven't really used these. The nice thing about the metric system, it's all based on tens. And even the decimals are a lot easy. But as soon as we get into the imperial system, as we noticed in the previous video, here's where you get fractions. So what you will notice is the scaling on the ruler. And on an imperial ruler, the scaling is in inches. So again, whenever you see inch, what it's telling you is these numbers that are highlighted represent an inch. And we see the graduations here. The smaller markings represent the fraction of an inch. And if we looked at these smallest markings right here, that's the smallest graduation. And if you counted all of those up from start to finish, what you would notice is there are 16 of those little marks. And if there's 16 of those little marks, then each one of those little marks represents 1/16 of an inch. So the smallest graduation on this ruler would be 1/16 of an inch, and that's pretty common. Some rulers get down to 1/32, but a 16th is pretty common. The next one you see is a little bit bigger mark. And if you counted all those from here to here, there would be 8 of them. So each one of these little ones, this one and this one and this one, each one of those represents 1/8 of an inch. So here's our graduation for an eighth of an inch. Now, as it says in boldface a little below, normally you'd see a line a little bit bigger than that, and it would represent a quarter. And on this one, it doesn't, so we won't talk about it. But finally, you have this one right here. So I'm just going to draw it underneath. So the biggest graduation is right there. And what you would probably guess is that is a 1/2 an inch. So in reading a ruler, we want to use the most obvious, the most obvious fraction. Like if you said, oh, something is 8/16 of an inch, you wouldn't be wrong, and people might understand that. But if you said something was a 1/2 inch, they would understand it a lot easier. And that's ultimately what we want to do. So in reading, going over reading imperial ruler, again, exactly the same as reading a metric ruler. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to read the number part, the inch part, and then you're going to read the fraction part, the in between. So we want to read the inch part, which is on a ruler, the number, like 1, 2, 3, 4 here. And then we're going to read the fraction part, which is the in between. So really simple language. It's the nice part and the not nice part, another way of saying it. So in this one right here, if I went through a couple, looking at A, well, again, A, imagine you put the ruler down and that's where you measured it to. It's at the smallest little mark there, and those smallest little marks represent sixteenths. And if you know that, that makes measuring a lot easier. So when we actually go ahead and count, it turns out that we are going to have 9/16. And again, remember, that's 9/16 of an inch. When we look at an example like B, well, B falls on one of those bigger hash marks. And if you counted the bigger hash marks, it might look something like, well, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, finally 7. We have 7 of those hash marks, so each one of those hash marks is 1/8 of an inch. So B would be measured to 7/8 of an inch. And just as a little aside, those little marks right there, you might have seen them before, a little tick tick. That's not the number 11. That's a little symbol that represents inch. If you had one little tick, that would be a foot. So again, I want you to go ahead and pause the video and figure out the measure of these in the smallest units and come back and see what I write. Okay, so in C, we're in between 1 and 2, and we're at this unit, and that unit right there is a half. So C is 1 1/2 inches. D, well, it's in between 2 and 3, and it's the third smallest mark along, and each one of those small marks is 1/16 of an inch. E is also on one of those small marks. So counting along, we have 7 of those small little marks, so it's 2 7/16 of an inch. F, well, it's between 3 and 4, so the first part is 3, and if we count along, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it's 5 of the smallest little divisions, so 5/16. And finally G, well, G is 4 and again, if you counted, well, I'm going to count quicker, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, there are 13. So G is 4 13/16 inches. So in class, we're just going to practice using our ruler a little bit and make sure we can measure some shapes around our room.